This video is a marking guide for an in-class assessment using the piece from the 2017 WACE exam, which is an extract from Troppo, the novel by Australian author Madelaine Dickie. The structure for this video will be based around 3 to 4 different ideas that you might explore when doing a close reading of this particular text. The first of these is to look at the piece of writing as a representation of a familiar narrator and the cultural space of Bali. And by this I mean, when I'm talking about the cultural space of Bali, I mean that we have an Australian author writing most likely for an Australian audience, and Bali has a particular place in the Australian imagination. It's quite a familiar space, even if you've never been there, because so many Australians go there, and it is even in some ways a part of our own imagination. Now, throughout this video, each section will begin with an image here of the 2 pages, and then it will enlarge, and I'll highlight and talk through some of the key observations that I have for it. Now, one of the first things you might want to note when reading this text is that we're immediately introduced here to a narrator who's familiar with Bali. Now, as an unseen text, you don't know where this came from in the novel, so you can't assume that it's from the beginning. And so here, though, we do have the clue here that the narrator, Penny, is familiar. And we have here, it's just after 4 a.m. The gas lamps of the morning market wink warm as fireflies. Here in Indo, I never get the feeling I'm the only person alive. So here we have the familiarity of the language, the reference to Indo rather than the more formal Indonesia. And then we have here on the next paragraph, as a teenager in Kuta, I often woke up before dawn. So this is a narrator who has quite a bit of experience of being in Bali. She is very familiar with this place, although we'll find in the text that she is still treated as an outsider. We also have in this, and I'll talk about it in our next section, the familiarity of Bali for Australia, that we're also immediately confronted with an unpleasant image of Australians. One of the things that this text brings to us is this contrast between Australian and Balinese culture. It's an important one to the text, and it also appears in 2 separate sections. Now, as a close reading, that's useful because then you get to see how an idea is developed, or get the opportunity to demonstrate for a marker how you can see how an idea is developed through a passage rather than just shown in one sentence. Now, in demonstrating this development of the representation of Australian culture, I'll be drawing on these 2 sections here from the start of the text and further on when we have this discussion around shopping here in Australia. So returning to the beginning of the text, we have here, as a teenager in Kuta, I often woke up before dawn when the nightclubs locked the tills and drunk Aussies swung their legs over rental bikes, went screaming and careening through the alleys. So this instant image here is of the drunken Aussie stereotype, that bogan Australian stereotype. But from the language here, we see that our narrator is not among them, that she is not a typical tourist in Bali going there to get drunk and tattooed. She is there to experience the culture. She's getting up early to see Bali for itself, and not for the stereotype or the cultural stereotype that we have of it. Now, further in the text, we have this contrast to the shopping experience. Penny has just had an experience, if you want to say, of discrimination, where she's gone to buy something and then found that she was getting unfavorable treatment. I'll be talking about that further on. Discrimination is a bit of a superficial way of looking at it. But Here we have her talking really favourably of the shopping experience. We see here that where Penny says, "It's so different to shopping in Australia. I love the pace of it, love the laughter, love how when I offer a price, the women roll their eyes and wail, 'Too low, too low. We'll go broke,' and then they'll change the subject. We go to talk about men or goats. Then after a while, one of the women will offer another price. I think about grocery shopping in Australia, the plethora of choice, the sterility, the waxy, tasteless fruit, the indifferent or surly or bored staff on the checkouts, blowing their noses, checking their watches, sitting with these women yarning, arguing and bartering. I feel so much more comfortable, so much more alive." So here we have, as a reader, a confrontation with our everyday life, one that's so familiar to us as being so unpleasant, when many readers might see this market idea of being in Bali as somehow third world or some other pejorative term like that. And we have a narrator here saying, no, it's being more alive, it's being more human. It forces us to look at our own world as being sterile and inhuman. So it's an interesting contrast here that Penny constructs, and further shows us that she is a lot more familiar in this world. She is not simply a tourist. This is the experience of a worldly traveller. Now, the use of Indonesian language in this text is something really worth paying attention to, simply because so much of it is given without translation, and I'll give you some examples of that right now. Now, for this analysis here, I'll be focusing on the midsection of the text here, where this becomes really apparent. So you'll notice when you've read this text that so often you're not given a translation and there's no footnotes. And that's simply because Madelaine Dickie has done this very deliberately. You're expected as a reader to infer from the meaning, but also this shows us how our narrator is so familiar with the text. Here's an example. "Pagi Bu, I greet the kaki lima owner. Boleh minta pisang goreng? How much do you want?" she replies. "Dua ribu." The woman looks at me and firms her mouth. "We only sell 5,000 rupiah worth of pisang goreng." So here, I don't know what dua ribu means, but I can infer what it means here. But also, we get the opposite side of the conversation. What's interesting is that we have the Penny's side of the dialogue given to us in Indonesian, but the replies of the local Balinese given in English. It's a really interesting language device here, where I think normally we would expect to see our narrator giving their own speech in English and then an Indonesian reply from the other person. And so this is an interesting spin on the language, an interesting use of the language. And there's two ways I think you could look at this. One is that it forces the reader to engage with this Indonesian culture through their reading. Secondly, perhaps it puts the reader, it slightly alienates the reader, makes the reader have the experience of being an outsider through the language that puts us on the outside, where we're having to grasp and guess at meaning. It's a really neat sort of thing that's being done here. And I would imagine in doing a close reading, one should always note this, that's unusual. Even if your interpretation of it is a little bit wonky, simply by acknowledging that this is unusual, that we have this use of non-English language without translation, is a device being used by the author. We then get a shift in this use of the Indonesian further on, where Penny meets some people more familiar to her, and they are attempting to use English language. So here we have, "Hello, mister, you looking okay?" And so as a reader, you look at this word mister and it can throw you. You could think, hang on, do they think Penny's a guy or something like that? And that would be a mistake. This is simply a mistranslation from the local Indonesians. one reading might say, oh, that they're illiterate, but I'd say that that's a really shallow reading as well. That when we look in the context of the action of this piece, we have locals attempting to speak the language of the foreigner, and that's what happens when we do that. But we have here the Indonesian side of this being in an attempted English, and then we have Penny talking back to them, trying to speak in Indonesian with them. What does this do? It presents us with a narrator and a character who is making a sincere attempt to, I don't want to use the word integrate, but to be part of the culture and learn from the culture by using the language, which is again in stark contrast to those drunken Australians careening and screaming in the early part, who we can assume aren't really making an attempt to learn about the culture. Another way of looking at this piece is that it represents the experience of alienation, the stranger in a foreign land sort of trope, that sort of story there. It's a common one we see throughout in the history of this genre, this travel literature genre, and we'll look at this a little bit more closely. For this part, we'll be focusing on Penny's experience when she is in the shop and has that, I guess you could call, negative experience in trying to purchase something. So here we have Penny trying to buy some pisang goreng, and she's told that she can only buy 5,000 rupee. We only sell 5,000 rupee, and meaning she has to buy more. And then she asks, do you sell 2,000 worth? And then she tells us that Ibu Ayu paid 2,000 rupiah only a few days earlier. And the woman shakes her head and goes back to flipping the bananas. A moment later, a man approaches with his son and orders 2,000 worth of pisang goreng, and the woman spoons it into a paper bag. So here you've got a shop owner seeing an Australian woman coming in and demanding that she spend more than what the locals would. Some students might look at this as, discrimination or even racism, and I think that's a really flawed way of looking at it. I think what you're seeing in this text here is those cultural norms where the foreigner, particularly the wealthy one, has a different experience to the locals, and anyone who's travelled widely would have experienced that. But what this does do inside the text here is remind the reader that as much as Penny works hard to learn the language and learn the culture, she will always be an outsider, a foreigner. And I think that's the point here. It's not about Indonesians are racist or anything like that, which some students might interpret. It's really more that that barrier, that otherness that Penny's experiencing is a barrier that may not be crossed. Yet in this text, this isn't a story of complete alienation, because we have a kinship relationship here, a friendship emerging, and that's between Penny and the women in the text. And for this analysis, we'll be looking at this section in the bottom of the first page and this section near the top of the second page. What is interesting in this passage is the familiarity that Penny has, the solidarity she has with the women. She's welcome to sit among them. Someone asks if I'd like a chair as I look through the pieces and talk to them about their families, their children, their husbands, their goats. They tell me they caught past to Batu on the mountains this morning. And so she has this familiar, friendly discussion. And this then moves into a discussion of how, what time, and Penny then faints tiredness and does this show in order to have friendly banter with the women. What I find particularly interesting is here where it talks about, we go back to talking about men or goats. It's this way of it's kind of equating men with goats as men with mere livestock, which is amusing. It's amusing banter between women, this kinship between women that we see in the passage. And then after that we see one of the women offers another price, a lower price than the last. So then this bartering, this discussion of price isn't simply about commerce and how much money people are making. It's actually a cultural exchange, that the process of talking about prices is a process of making connections between people. And then we have our contrast to Australia, where it's Australian culture going to the shop is simply transactional, buy, sell, money exchanged, and board checkout operators. But in Indonesia, it's a cultural experience and an experience of friendship. But what I find particularly interesting is right here at the end, and it's while I felt safe and shielded by the warm gossip of the women on my way out, I have an unnerving feeling that I'm being followed. Implied in this, or what you might infer as a reader, is that the being followed is by men, that the threat that exists here is a male threat. That invites a gendered reading of this text, that talks about the solidarity that we see in the text between women, and one where men are either goats or boyfriends and that sort of stuff, or when she leaves, men are the threat to her physical safety. Now this video has gone longer than I anticipated, but hopefully you found it useful. The best way you can make use of this is to look back over your own response and the marking key, and use this information to reflect on your reading and consider the cues that would alert you to possibilities for strong readings. And by that I mean look back over this and you might see points I've raised now and had the thought of, oh, I can see that now. Well, then reflect on what the cues are that I would have seen, and then you can start to think about that for future unseen close readings. Good luck with that, and I hope this has been helpful to you.